Carla only has the best tech.
Can't connect to network.
But she didn't have the best internet. So she got Cox multi-gig speeds to power all her... Now, all her tech is...
Connected.
Exactly. Step it up with multi-gig speeds. Available everywhere. Only from Cox. 2 gig download speeds. Individual speeds vary. See cox.com for details.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Living in New York City, my understanding of the fires in Los Angeles is totally mediated by images on the internet. Pictures of embers swirling in the wind. A kid's video of his devastated neighborhood with the caption, "Bye house." And of course, the maps. But it wasn't until I called up Gabrielle Canon from over at The Guardian that I realized how universal the fear is in LA. We talked back on Friday.
I was on the fireline for much of yesterday and the day before, but you kind of duck out to check in and get service or file copy. And so I'd be like in some little cafe, like using the bathroom and trying to get cell service. And then everyone's phones collectively would start wailing that another evacuation order had been extended. And so I think people are just getting hammered because it feels like you really have nowhere to go or it feels completely safe.
Gabrielle's been staying with her mom, helping to get her go bag ready. Her day job, though, is as an extreme weather correspondent. The first person to have that title at her paper. So this fire is definitely her area of expertise.
It's rare in my line of work with my beat for me to be left speechless, but that's how it felt. I mean, walking through this community that was, people described to me as a sanctuary for families, and it's gone. It's completely gone. Even if your house is saved, there's little left for you there if your community's gone. I mean,
yeah, what are you going back to?
Yeah, exactly. The Palisades looks like a war zone. It's completely unrecognizable.
As she reports, Gabrielle looks for firefighters to give her a little indication of how things are going. One told her that for every house they'd saved, they'd lost 4 more. She ran into one group that had come down from Lake Tahoe, which is a full day's drive away. They'd spent a lot of their time trying to save a single home.
One of the more shocking aspects of this event is we've seen some questions around whether or not firefighters were doing enough or whether they had enough support. And I was shocked to see that. I mean, it is absolutely, they are throwing everything at this thing.
I'm so glad you brought up the blame game, because I've really noticed that too. And I wonder, when you talk to people on the ground, homeowners, firefighters, how are they processing this fire? Like, are they angry?
I think there are some people who will be. I think there are people who are looking for a reason. But, what we know from what I know, even just from being on this beat for so long, I think the first moments of processing this generally are just trying to understand the scope of the loss. Ultimately, I think people are kind of reaching for answers that are easier to hold.
Do those answers exist yet?
I would say they don't exist yet. From what we're hearing on the ground, this was something that was impossible to stop.
Today on the show, sorting out who's to blame for the Los Angeles fires. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Washington Wise. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear stories making news right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. I want to talk about this raging fight over who's to blame for these wildfires. You're a climate reporter. I'd call myself a progressive person. I think in a situation like this, I naturally jump to climate change as a factor here, partially because January is not usually fire season in Southern California, right?
Yeah. We'll obviously, I think, look to scientists to help us paint a clearer picture of what happened here. But just anecdotally, I can tell you, you're exactly right. Typically, we will get strong winds in January. This is an area that has always had these Santa Anas. We get them through the autumn and into winter. The difference is the region didn't get the rains that it needed to make sure that the fire risks were tamped down.
Yeah, it's funny because I remember last year around this time, we were doing a show about all of the rain in California. Like we were talking about this atmospheric river that was dumping tons of water on the West Coast. And are you basically saying like, oh, that didn't happen this year?
Yeah, exactly. And so that's actually exactly the kind of model that climate scientists have been warning us about. So we're going to have these boom and bust cycles where the rains come fast and heavy and you see floods, and then we'll have periods of extreme dryness. And so what ends up happening is when those rains come in a very strong way, they seed the ground, the vegetation grows, and of course, then followed by the heat and the dryness, it just bakes the moisture right out of the landscape, teeing up more catastrophic fire conditions. So absolutely, I think we can say the broader trends align, right, with the climate crisis, with what we know will continue to unfold as the world warms.
Yeah. One thing that I think has been striking to a lot of people who are following this fire remotely is how the firefighters seem to run out of water while they were still battling flames. Like literally fire hydrants went dry, which seems blameworthy to me. But I'm curious how you see it on the ground.
What actually ended up happening wasn't necessarily a water supply issue, but a water pressure issue. And so because they were fighting these fires on these slopey hillsides, obviously that water has to go uphill to get to them. And so when they're just putting such extreme demands on a system that wasn't built to battle this scale of a fire, not to mention, if you think of the system more broadly across Los Angeles in terms of management, in terms of capacity, they had fires on every front. And so I think you could certainly make an argument, and I know this is something that will be looked at in the coming weeks, of if Los Angeles was prepared, if this is something, we knew could happen, why weren't we more prepared for it? But I think at this point, I believe that everything they could do, they did do. It was something that, of course, ended up coming with catastrophe. I mean, they couldn't get water in an area that was about to go up. And I spoke to actually a resident who waited to try to save his home and then ended up escaping as the fire kind of came down his block. But he said that he was there when the taps kind of went dry, and it was this harrowing moment of realization that his community was going to burn.
This, of course, didn't stop Donald Trump from suggesting that somehow Gavin Newsom hadn't opened up every valve in California's water system to get that water to Los Angeles. I'm wondering if you can explain what Trump was even alluding to here. Like, he was saying that Gavin Newsom should let the water flow into the state rather than into the ocean.
Yeah.
Is this even a thing Newsom could have done?
No, not at all. So I think, I'm laughing just because it's such an outrageous thing to say. But, I think this really shows how little our next president knows about the issues in this area. I'm sure that he is remembering from his first administration. There was a particular battle that he waged on California and water use. But at that point, it was on behalf of agriculture and other industries that wanted more access to water that was being left in the Delta, which is not where Los Angeles gets its water from. So it's something that, he's remembering an issue, and I think probably a flashpoint that he received a lot of attention for several years ago on a completely separate issue. It's not even connected to this. And so I know Trump has made incredibly misleading claims. The thing that is really upsetting about this is that, like we spoke about earlier, people are looking for someone to blame. They are looking for a way to make sense of this. And the distractions away from the real issues to inflame divisions and to, spark feelings of anger really are the last thing that these communities need.
Los Angeles's mayor, Karen Bass, has also found herself in the crosshairs of critics. First, because she was out of town when the fires broke out. Then there were questions about the LA Fire Department budget. It turns out that Bass did technically approve a budget for the department that was $23 million less than the previous year. But that's because department raises were approved in a separate funding request. Still, LA's fire chief went on local news just before the weekend and said, none of this is enough.
We are still understaffed, we're still under-resourced, and we're still underfunded. So with that, whether it's $7 million, $10 million.
But was the budget cut, Chief?
Yes, it was cut, and it did impact our ability to provide service.
Turns out the chief had sent a memo to the Board of Fire Commissioners just last month, sounding the alarm about requests to reduce overtime hours and eliminate vacant positions.
What is your message to city administrators, starting with Mayor Bass?
My message is the fire department needs to be properly funded.
And it's not.
It's not at this point, and we've got the justification. We know where our gaps in service are. We know we need 62 new fire stations. We need to double the size of our firefighters. The growth of this city since 1960 has doubled, and we have less fire stations.
Let's repeat that.
Firefighters are saying we're feeling overworked. We're feeling like we don't have the resources we need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, we can certainly have the conversation about resources. We're seeing this issue come up in other agencies and other levels of government. The Forest Service, for example, has seen its budget grow, but it is also completely stagnated its pay for firefighters. Obviously, we just, the Biden administration put forward a temporary pay boost for federal firefighters that has been sort of extended again and again while Congress kicks its feet on trying to create a permanent pay solution. But what has ended up happening out of that political battle is we are seeing folks leave the Forest Service and other federal firefighting agencies. But also, it's sort of this balancing act to make sure that there's enough money for preparation and adaptation. And this, again, is the climate change balancing act, right? It's like, how do you ensure that you have enough resources to defend against the extreme weather events that we're going to get from climate change, while also investing in improving infrastructure and getting communities ready and putting plans in place.
God, I'm struck by the unseriousness. with which this real problem is being treated. Like we haven't even gotten into the blame that was being thrown around by someone like, the Libs of TikTok account, which was looking at like DEI and like, is that to blame because the LA Fire Department promoted someone who's the first female LGBTQ fire chief?
It's disgusting to hear things like that because it is absolutely taking advantage of a moment of crisis. I mean, I saw on Fox News, they had the same allegation against the fire chief, who is, by the way, extremely credentialed. And so it's, again, we're going back to these divisions that are being created in the midst of a disaster when what we need are solutions, what we need are for people to be able to come together.
It reminds me of what happened in North Carolina a few months back when the hurricane rolled through and there was this tremendous flooding. And right away, people were saying FEMA's to blame because it's not helping people recover. It's skipping over Trump supporters, saying people had sent this storm for political reasons. I wonder for a reporter like you who just regularly goes into climate disaster zones, how is your work changing?
It makes it a lot harder because you're competing with things that are completely fabricated. And it really distracts from the key issues that need to be communicated and need to be discussed.
And those key issues are like boring. They're like zoning.
Right.
Like what plants you're planting,
Yes. But it's also, I think, having even more dramatic effects. And so, you mentioned the hurricane where you literally had squads of people going out to try to go after like federal workers who are there to help them. I mean, I know of firefighters who were there on the ground who traveled across the country to help in this moment. And they were afraid. They were afraid to be in those spaces because these people were so angry.
We'll be right back after a quick break. This episode is brought to you by Washington Wise. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear stories making news right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. Hey, it's Mary, host of Slate's daily news show, What Next? I don't have to tell you how tricky it can be to stay on top of the news.
But for Canadian listeners, the headlines are coming in hot and heavy.
Hey, Jesse.
Hi, Mary. I'm Jesse Brown. I am host of the podcast Canadaland.
Canadaland is Slate's secret weapon for staying on top of what's happening north of the border. You may have even heard some of their journalists as guests on this show.
She's talking about me.
Canadaland brings listeners vital conversations, untold stories, and unique perspectives on breaking news from some of Canada's best journalists.
To listen to the show and join the conversation, just search for Canadaland in your podcast app.
Slate Money is a weekly discussion of the most important stories in the world of business and finance. Over the past 10 years, we've become known as the place to go if you want to understand what's going on in business, or if you just want to laugh at some of its successes. So if you want a podcast that doesn't turn CEOs into heroes, listen to Slate Money with me, Felix Salmon, and my co-hosts Emily Peck and Elizabeth Spires every Saturday morning, wherever you get your podcasts.
So let's talk about what happens in the coming days and weeks. Like, obviously, the city of Los Angeles is still actively struggling, but we'll also start thinking about recovery of some kind. And recovery, I assume, is going to need to include both federal and local government, especially since so many are expecting this to be like the most expensive wildfire recovery ever. Um, Given the fact that we're about to have a new president, one who's started nicknaming the governor of California Gavin Newscum, what does that mean?
Yeah, yeah. It's incredibly scary to think about when disasters become politicized. I mean, a lot of people don't have the resources to just endlessly stay in hotels, or they won't have a space to go, or say, a lot of these rural areas have large animals. Where are they going to stay? All of these questions need to be answered in the coming weeks. It's going to be incredibly important for local and state and federal agencies to all be on the same page. The fear that comes to my mind that we've seen when fires occur in times like these, when it's in the winter, after a fire, I mean, if you've seen the photos, right, it looks like the moon, right? You have like maybe some sparse vegetation, but there's very little left. And that top layer of soil is really unstable. And so when you get a hard rain on that unstable burn scar, it just goes, it just slides. And so we've seen this happen before, where folks who went through a wildfire experience then went through a mudslide experience that's incredibly dangerous and scary. And so even if your home is left standing, it can then be destroyed in like the next event. So there's a lot of work still to be done. And the horrifying part is we're still in the disaster, right? Like, I mean, the winds have not stopped. They're continuing to howl. So that's going to keep spreading the fires that are already lit, but also it's going to rapidly spread fires that start. But in the coming weeks, this next level is going to be unlocked.
One thing I've noticed is that while Donald Trump has appointed heads of a lot of agencies and cabinet positions, he hasn't appointed a head of FEMA yet. And this is FEMA's turf, man. This is what FEMA is supposed to be doing, going in and helping once a disaster occurs. And what I'm noticing right now, as someone who's thousands of miles away, is just how many people are trying to raise money for themselves, totally separate from the government. Like if you go to GoFundMe, there is one fundraiser after another, family after family. And it just made me wonder how much people are a little bit on their own at this moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, it's to go through an experience like this where you've had this terrifying evacuation, with nowhere to go. We now are seeing the fatality count rise. So people are still in the throes of this event. They are grieving, they are processing. And the daunting task of having to figure out, oh, did I have photos of my home to submit to my insurance? Do I have insurance? Do I have enough insurance? How do I file a claim to FEMA? Will FEMA be there for me? Like, am I going to get taken care of? I mean, we see this happen in other disasters too. And, when the news starts to take focus on the next thing, on the next disaster that'll unfold, or, the next big political controversy, these people will be left to just grapple with the sheer, just a steep climb out of this moment.
Part of what you're making me realize is like the government's job in a disaster like this is partially to figure out what's fair, who needs the help, like just based on like humanity. And that's not what happens on social media. If you have a GoFundMe, like we know that's unfair. We know that like if you have the best family pictures and the best story and the most connections online, we know that your fundraiser is going to do better. And so if that's the mechanism people are relying on right now, it will be inherently unfair.
Right. And I think, another aspect of all of this is because this wasn't some like one house, it was whole neighborhoods. People at this moment are going to have to sort of go out on their own to try to like get the resources they need, but there won't ever be those communities again. We look at sort of the basic metrics of a disaster, houses lost, acres burned, things like that. But you really can't measure like the loss of your community, the people that you rely on, or the people that you're connected to, people who, may know each other for their whole lives or have grown up together. they might end up in different places now. Or even yesterday, there was, I heard from some people in the Palisades area, a couple who had lived in this neighborhood for years and years. They were in their 90s. I mean, they're not going to see that community be rebuilt in their lifetime.
You talk about rebuilding. And one thing I know you've reported on is that when we think about rebuilding, it's going to be useful to think about what houses survived the fire and what didn't. And like how houses that survived may have had screens on them that would have caught embers rather than letting them just spark on a house, making sure there's a water tank on your property and all this stuff. It's stuff where it's like it calls for regulations. It calls for rules about how we build things.
Mm-hmm.
Those rules are hard to make. California already has a housing crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Housing is really expensive. It's been unable to pass legislation that would have provided more housing.
Yeah.
And I think about that and I'm like, oh, that's like the threat down the line, Like it's like there's the hit of losing your home. There's a hit of thinking about rebuilding. And then there's this huge fight about like how to rebuild and who has the money to do it. And it feels enormous to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not only enormous for these people who are impacted, but I think it's enormous across the board. We've even in Northern California fires seen folks who have moved to different areas after being burned out, and then there were different fires that displaced them again. And so people are, I think, trying to figure out where is safe and how they can prepare. And preparation, can take resources. And I think there needs to be sort of a stronger collective effort to not only make sure the information is available on how you can better protect your home, but also that there are resources available to do that. Because as we know, you're only as safe as your community. If your neighbor's house doesn't have vegetation clearance or defensible space or doesn't have their screens up to protect against embers, then your house can still be at risk. So I think kind of marching together as communities is going to be essential. It all speaks to just this moment that we're in, that we know this big snowball is rolling. We know that the world is warming, and there needs to be a focus on both how we address climate change, but really also how we adapt to it, because we're in it. It's happening now.
Gabrielle, I'm really grateful for your time and for your reporting. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Gabrielle Canon is a climate reporter and extreme weather correspondent for The Guardian US. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Anna Phillips. We're led by Alicia Montgomery. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go ahead and track me down on Blue Sky if you want. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.